Hashem, today's Daf Yomi is Zevachim 36. Actually, it's Zevachim 37, and we're going to start in the bottom of Amavav Amabeis, the bottom at the new chapter at the beginning of the Mishnah. Beis Shammai Omrim Kohen Itanan al Mizbeach Achitzon Shenatan b'matana achas kiper uv'chata shtei matanos. So we know that there are two different altars in the temple. There's the Mizbeach HaChitzon, the outer altar, which is in the courtyard, also called the copper altar, also called the altar of the Olah. That's where the animals primarily went on. And then there's the inner altar, which is the altar of the incense, the altar of gold. And you have to apply the blood in different times to different parts of these altars. Generally, most korbanos have the two applications that are for. The blood was sprinkled on two opposite corners, and it's spread to each of the sides around it. So that's two, that is four. But Beis Shammai says that all the applications on the outer altar, if you only did one application of the blood, kippur, it's sufficient. You don't need to do, although it's a mitzvah to do all four. If you only did two of them, if you only did one, it's sufficient. Ubechatas, and the korban chatas, which generally speaking applies the chatas, which is supposed to have application by the finger on all the four horns of the altar. The chatas, Beis Shammai says you need b'diavad at least shtei matanos, two applications. Beis Hillel omrim af chatas shenasna matana achas keeper. Beis Hillel says chatas is like the others, and you only need one. So therefore, since according to Beis Shammai, most korbanos you only need one, and by chatas you only need two. Now, let's say you put the first application of blood on the chatas properly, and then the second one you did, meaning the first one you have with the proper thought, and the second one, and then the second one, you did it beyond the proper time, meaning to say what it would normally be a pigul thought. Under those circumstances, we're going to say, since you already did the first one properly, kippur, we're going to say it's not a pigul thought, and therefore you've achieved atonement. And the reason is, as Rashi says, kippur v'kosher carbon shekfar nitera carbon l'karav v'yidei matan rishona, because the material of the carbon, the reason the carbon was already allowed through the first application. Veina shniya materas asabasar. The second application is not a matir anymore, because technically speaking, you only need the first one, and the pigul has to come during one of the avodas hamatirim. And so therefore, since it wasn't required, therefore, it doesn't make pigul if you have the pigul thought then. Let's say you put the first one beyond the proper time and the second one beyond the proper place, then we're going to say pigul v'chayav and olav kares. Then we're going to say it's a pigul thought because the first one happened during the matirim. And even though sometimes there are what's called eruvin machshavos, that the two thoughts mingle and it makes it no longer pigul but apostle. But in this case, since the first thought was the matirin, you don't need the second one, therefore it doesn't take away the pigul. Then the last clause, it's called anything that's applied to the inner altar, where we have to apply on all four corners of the altar. That if you miss one, there you need all four. So if you miss one, you haven't achieved atonement. Therefore, if you put all of them properly, but one of them you didn't, then we're going to say it's disqualified. The aimbo kares, and there's no kares. Let's look at what Rashi says. Rashi says, therefore, since all of them are necessary to be materas, therefore you need all of them, and therefore you can't have pigul unless they were all applied, because pigul only applies when all the materin are applied. And so therefore, if you do kulan kashtika, all of them with a proper thought and one with improper thought, then there's no kares. It's disqualified because the first ones don't apply and there's no kares, because the last one is not going to allow pigul, because Rashi says, "Kasaver ein mefaga mechatzi matir." You can't have a pigul with just a half of a mat. So now, again, we're Boker Tov to everyone. So now we say that we've said, according to Beis Shammai, you only need one application of the blood, b'di'evet, even though the Torah often requires more in almost every case, often asks for more, but technically speaking, you only need one to fulfill your requirement. So now the Gemara wants to know the source for that, and the Gemara is going to cite a source, and then the Gemara is going to say that this pasuk is only needed for three other possibilities, and that's going to be the first part of the daf. How do we know this idea that if you only do one application of blood on the outer altar, it's sufficient? Gemara says we're learning it out from the pasuk that says, "V'dam zevachecha yishafech," that you shall, the blood of your korban you shall pour. Now, pouring implies only one application, because when you pour out the utensil, everything comes out, and so therefore we see even one application is sufficient. Gemara, and now I said we're going to suggest three other possibilities for this pasuk. Don't we need this pasuk to teach us like the following price of taught? Top of Lamed Dayan Amanal. How do we know that whenever there's anything left in your cup after you did the zrika on the mizbeach, after you sprinkled the blood, and there's anything left, that you have to throw it, you have to pour it out? So you have to pour it onto the foundation. You have to pour all the shirayim. So that's what the pasuk dam zevachecha yishafech is teaching us, to pour out the shirayim on the yisod, not to teach us that one application is sufficient. Mar says no, nafkala midir. No, the author of our Mishnah or the author of this brisa, will learn out from Rabbi. The Tanya Rabbi Omar vanishar badam yimat say. It says the remainder of the chatos of the oath, the bird sin offering, after you sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach, you press it against the mizbeach, but it doesn't need to say the word badam. Shein tam omer badam, because the word badam is already mentioned in that pasuk, so it's unnecessary. So ma tam omer badam. Because we wouldn't only know from this that we would only know that the blood of the sin offering, the shirayim, has to be poured down to the altar when it's left because of the chatos, because that is the only thing that's explicit in the pasuk. But shar dam minayin, how do we know that all blood is poured down? Tamor nishar badam yimatzeh. So therefore, the author of the first price, it doesn't need dam zevachecha yishafech. It doesn't need it to teach us this idea that you have to pour the shirayim, because he learns it out from the pasuk vanishar badam yimatzeh. Second possibility, where it says "Vakati u'achudasa," this price are really teaching us from dam zevachecha yishafech that one application of blood is sufficient. But don't we need it to teach us the following? Vakati u'achudasa mibayel l'gedetanya minayel nisanim bezrika shenisanan b'shvicha. How do we know that if there's two types of ways in which you could apply the blood, actually more than two, but two main types which you can apply the blood to the altar. One is the zrika, which is where you take the utensil, you stand far a little bit of a distance, and you sprinkle it from the utensil on the altar. But then there's also shaficha, which is you pour it all out. So how do we know that if the Torah tells us to do zrika, but instead you did shficha, that you poured it out, you have to fulfill your obligation? Dam zevachecha yishafech. From the pasuk, dam zevachecha yishafech. So we see from here that the pasuk isn't teaching us one application is sufficient. Pasuk is teaching us shficha can cover you even if the Torah just calls for zrika. The Gemara says no. The author of our brisa doesn't say that, because he holds like Rabbi Akiva, who says that shficha is not a replacement for zrika. So like Rabbi Akiva, the Amar lo zrika b'kol shvicha v'lo shvicha b'kol zricha. That he says zricha is not included in shvicha and shvicha is not included in zrika. And where do we know this? From a Mishnah, the last Mishnah in Pesachim. It says, "Beirach berachas haPesach pater shel zevach will pater as haPesach." That there is a bracha. Rashi tells us the exact bracha. that Asher Kishon Tosav Tzivanu Lecho HaPesach. Before you eat the Korban Pesach, you make that bracha. There's also another korban you could eat that night, which is the Shalmei Chagiga, and that pasuk is Asher Tzivanu Lecho Zevach. So the Mishnah tells us that if you made the bracha on the Korban Pesach, you don't need to make the bracha again on the Korban Chagiga. But if you made the bracha on the Korban Chagiga, shall Zevach or Pater Pesach, you still need to make the bracha on the Korban Pesach. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. And the assumption of the Gemara is that this is connected to the idea of whether or not shvicha is sufficient for zrika, because since the Korban Pesach requires shaficha and the shlamim requires zricha, so the bracha on the Korban Pesach will also cover the Chagiga, whereas the Chagiga will not cover the Korban Pesach. Whereas Rabbi Akiva Omer will zupotar zu will zupotar zu. Then neither one will exempt the other. So Rabbi Akiva is so the author of Rabraisa is like Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva doesn't use that pasuk of Dam Zevachecha Yishafech to tell us that shvicha is going to cover zrika. So the Gemara says, but still, don't we need that pasuk to teach us something else? Like Hati Lahachi Udasa, Mibailak Ditanya, a different Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael Omer Mitoch Shenemer Ach Bechor Shor or Bechor Chasev or Bechor Eis. Since it says in the pasuk Bechor Shor or Bechor Chasev or Bechor Eis that all of these all of these firstborn animals of the sheep, the ox, the sheep, or the goat, you're not allowed to redeem. They are holy. Their blood you shall sprinkle on their altar. That's called bam takdir, and their fats you shall burn. Amanu, so what does Rabbi Shmuel do with that? It teaches us that the firstborn animal requires application of the blood, the emurim and the innards on the altar. Ma'aser Pesach minayin. So how do we know that the ma'aser, that the 10th animal that comes through the corral and the Korban Pesach also require application of blood and burning of the emurim? You learned that from this pasuk. Dam zevachecha yishafech. So how can we say dam zevachecha yishafech teaches us only one application of blood is sufficient? Don't we need it to teach us these laws that you need matan damin by bechor, meiser, and pesach? So the Gemara says, no, because the author of our brisa is several like Rabbi Yossi Aguli. He holds like Rabbi Yossi Aguli. The Dayan Rabbi Yossi Aguli Omer damo nemar el damam. It doesn't say in the pasuk damo. It says damam to teach us. To teach us, it's from, he learns that idea from Damam and Chalbam as opposed to Damo and Chalbo. So therefore, that's why Dam Zevachecha Yishafech is just needed to teach us one application of blood. So the Gemara says, wait 1 second, we just cited Rabbi Shmuel teaching us two different things. We had Rabbi Shmuel teaching us that Shvicha includes Zerika, and also he taught us that the Bechor has the same law by the Meiser and the Pesach, that they need application of blood anymore. So Gemara says, Rabbi Shmuel, we have the same pasuk. He's doing two separate teachings from it. Gemara says, no, Trei Tanai, I'll leave it to Rabbi Shmuel. There's two different Tanaim, and they each had a tradition of what Rabbi Shmuel used for that pasuk. So Gemara says, Bishlam Rabbi Shmuel the Mukul Kula Bechor. It makes sense, according to Rabbi Shmuel. He says that whole pasuk refers to Bechor. Gemara is on a little bit of a tangent here now, just this next few lines. That Rabbi Shmuel says the pasuk refers to Bechor, meaning to say that you need, the whole pasuk refers to a Bechor, and so therefore it means going back to the pasuk. He says Bechor Shor Bechor Chasav Bechor is to teach us that the Bechor requires matadam memurim on the altar, and so therefore he learns it all out from that pasuk. So it makes sense why he says he says that's why the next that the pasuk, when the pasuk tells us in the next pasuk that the Kohanim get it, it makes sense because the Kohanim get the Bechor, get the meat. Rabbi Yossi says that pasuk also refers to telling us that Meiser and the Pesach require the application of the blood and also the emurim on the altar. So what about the next pasuk? It says Uvasarami Elach. What does he do with that? The owners eat it, not the Kohanim. The owners eat the Meiser and the Pesach, not the Kohanim. So Meiser Pesach Baal Machlei. So the Gemara says, no, Mayu Basar Mia. What does it mean, Basar Mia Loch? Echatan ve'echad Baal Mum. It means to say that refers to both types of Bechor, that there could be a Bechor with which is pure, which goes as an offering, and a Bechor which has a blemish, which the Kohen keeps, but the Kohen keeps it. It doesn't go back to the owner. Limit on top of Lamed Zayin on base, limit al Bechor Baal Mum, Shenisen LaKohen. Shalom Matzinu B'Kol Torah Kula, because we don't ever find it explicit in the whole Torah. So, and how does Rabbi Shmuel know this idea that the Kohen gets both the Balmum and the Tamim Bechor? He nafkilei, Shmuel nafkilei milchayeh this sefer. He learns that from the end of the pasuk, which repeats milchayeh. So that's to teach us that the Kohen gets both Bechors. So then the Gemara says, Bishlam or Rabbi Yossi Agli the Mukilei Nami b'Maiser Pesach. Makes sense according to Rabbi Yossi Agli, says the pasuk refers to both Bechor and Meiser and Pesach to tell us this idea that they have their application in the blood and their imurim. That's why it says you can't redeem these animals because they are kodesh. Meaning to say, heim craven ve'ain temura craven. It's to teach us that the Meiser and the Pesach they are brought, but it's to tell us the Meiser and Pesach are not krivim, but they are brought, but their temura of them are not brought. The Tanan, because we learned in the Mishnah, what's a temura again? Temura is if you try to exchange your animal, your sacred animal, with another animal. You're not allowed to, but if you did it, it generally speaking takes on the holiness of the animal. So they both have the same holiness. But by the Meiser and the Pesach, the exchanged animal can still not be brought as a korban. And how do we know that? Because it says in the Mishnah in Temura is a tremendous masach. We'll get to that soon, God willing. Temura, Bechor, Meiser, Hain. When it comes to the Temuras, the exchange of the Bechor and the Meiser, Hain, the animals themselves, the Uvvadan, their offspring and their offspring's offspring, that's Sof Kol Olam, until the end of time. Harein ke Bechor Meiser, they have the same holiness as the Bechor Meiser, but the Yochim b'Mumim L'Balim, but nevertheless, means say you can't redeem them, but they're not able to be brought on the altar when they are Tamimim, but rather you have to wait until they get a blemish, and then the owners can eat them. So therefore, we see from here that Temuras Meiser is not brought as a korban. So, Utanan, and how do we know this by the Pesach as well? Well, we learn it from the following statement that Amar Rabbi Yeshua Shemati Shetemura Pesach Kreva, Temuras Pesach Ina Kreva. He says, Rabbi Yeshua says, I heard that the exchange of the Pesach is brought, but also the exchange of the Pesach is not brought. The Enel Farsh, and I don't know how to explain it. And Rashi tells us the end of that Gemara. The Kai Malon, the Temura, when is the Temura of the Pesach brought and when is it not brought? If it will be a Temura that you did after the Korban Pesach, that would be brought as a Korban because that's not a Pesach, that's a Shlomim. But if you did the Temura before the Korban Pesach was brought, then it's never brought as a Korban because it's a Temura of a Pesach. So Rashi tells us the end of the Gemara in Pesach and Tzadi Zayin. Tzadi Vav on the base. So then the Gemara says, so now the Gemara says, "Oh, Rabbi Shmuel, Demuki like Kua bebechor, Meiser Pesach to look raven to Murasam and So Rabbi Shmuel says that whole pasuk refers to a bechor. It doesn't refer to Meiser and Pesach. How does he know that the Meiser and Pesach Temur is not brought? Well, that he learns out from Meiser Gamar from Avram Bechor. He does a Gedera Shavah to Bechor. Pesach the Ejik Sibei, and Pesach is written explicitly. Where does it say it in the Pesach? It says Kasev. It says Pesach Beheja Sibei Kasev, not Tamum or Im Kasev. It could have just said Im Kasev. It could have just said Kasev. Why did it say Im Kasev? So it's coming to teach us. So Rabbos Temursa Pesach Achar Pesach Shitkarv Shalomim. That if you made a Temura of the Pesach after Pesach, in which case the Pesach morphed into a Shalomim. So at that point, Yacho Afafnei Pesach, and I might think even before Pesach, you could bring a Tamum or Hu. So it says Hu Hashem, meaning to say the Temuras of the Pesach is not brought. Only the Pesach is brought to Hashem. So now the Gemara says, So all these three other Tanaim who weren't this pasuk of Dam Zevachim Yishafech, or maybe it's two other times, because Rabbi Shmuel is twice. So all these other Tanaim who say this pasuk of Dam Zevachim Yishafech teaches us a different drasha. Hi, Kohen Itzanan Amazbech Achitzon Shenesanan. How do they know this law? Because the first price that we cited learned out this law that one application of blood is sufficient from Dam Zevachim Yishafech. How do they know it? And the Gemara says, Sabri Beis Hillel. No, they all like Beis Hillel, who says, Av chata shenitne matana achas kiper. Because Beis Hillel, and we're going to see now how Beis Hillel says that. He says one application of blood by the korban chatas is sufficient. The afikul mechatas, and everybody learns it out from the chatas. So how does Beis Hillel know this? So now the Gemara is going to cite a sugya, which basically you might remember we did at the very beginning of Masechet Sanhedrin. And it took up a Dalet Amud Aleph. It took up most of the daf, and a little bit of and the Gemara is going to cite it basically the same sugya here, word for word. Now, the basic point is, let me just take a step back. There is the concept of Yesh Eim U'Mesora and Yesh Eim U'Mikra. Yesh Eim U'Mesora. Remember that sugya? Do we follow the way the text is written, or do we follow the way the text is read? Sometimes there's a word in the Torah written without a vav or without a letter. And so it's written in the singular, but we read it in the plural. So if you follow this the way it's written, then it's singular. If you follow the way it's read, it's plural. So which do we give the primacy to? You could ask the question, why doesn't the Torah just write it all out properly? Why does the Torah have to make it more opaque? So the Radvaz explains, because the Torah wants on a deeper level for us to be, this is why there's no vowels in the Torah. The Torah wants us to open our mind, open the vistas to infinite interpretations. So if the Torah would put vowels, or sometimes if every word would be written Mali or Chaser, then it would limit our channels of interpretation. So Amar Afuna, my time in the Beis Shammai. What's the reason why Beis Shammai says that a chatas b'diavad requires two applications of blood? Because it's based upon the fact that it says karnos, karnos, karnos. It's written in the Torah that you have to take the. It says that there are three parashos in the three passages that are said about the sin offering, the outer sin offering. And it says there, the word karnos, that you apply the blood to the corners of the horns of the altar. And two of them, the word karnos is written without a vav, and one of them is written with a vav. But Beis Shammai follows Yesh Eim U'Mikra. We follow the way it's read. So therefore, it's 2, 4, 6. We read each one in the plural. Harei kan sheish. It's 6 applications of blood. And we know that whenever we have a principle in Zevachim and Karbanos, that whenever we repeat something, it's Shana Kosav La'akev. The Torah repeats it to say it's a requirement. So Arba mitzvah, so 4 is telling us is the ideal, but Shtayim, to get to 6, is La'akev, the last 2. So 2 of them are telling us 2 are necessary. Well, Beis Hillel, Karnos, Karnos, Karnos. Beis Hillel says don't read it as in the plural, but it's written, the first 2 are in the singular. Karnos, karnos, harei kan arba. So since you have 2 in the singular and only 1 in the plural, then you have 4. Shalosh mitzvah. 3 are told that it's a mitzvah, and one of them achas la'akev, and only one of them is repeated, and so it's telling us only 1 is required. Ve'ema kul mitzvah. So the Gemara says, well, maybe none of them are being repeated. Maybe all of them are being just for mitzvah, and meaning to say you don't need to do anything. So the Gemara says, no. You can never have an atonement with nothing. Meaning to say, also it's a very deep idea. You can't get an atonement for nothing. Atonement costs something. You have to have at least 1 application of the blood. The Gemara says, V'bayu same, or alternatively, you could say, what's the basis for Beis Hillel that there's 1 application of blood? It's not that there's 3 for mitzvah and then 1 is repeated to tell us 1 is essential. Maybe it is Ahani Mikra, Vahani Mesores. That Beis Hillel maybe hold like both. And he says, or maybe he says, we compromise. The Mikra, the Yesh Eim U'Mikra will get us to 6. Yesh Eim U'Mesora will get us to 4. So therefore, Ahani Mikra with Tefu Yechada, Vahani Mesora with Tzur Yechada. So since the Mikra gets us to 6, and the Masorah gets us to 4. We compromise. We go up 1 and we go down 1. And so therefore, that's how we say you need just 1. Meaning to say that we do the compromise. And so therefore we have 5 that are applications, and 4 of them are for mitzvah, and 1 of them is repeated. Let's look at the Rashi. The Ahani Mesoros, the Mashma Arba. Okay, Tafi Chada Mesoros. You add 1 onto the way it's written. Ubatir Chada Mikra. We delete we deduct 1 from the way it's read. Avul Chamesh Nimtza Shoshana Bacha. So it's repeated 1 of them. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, you're going to adopt that approach by the tefillin. It says, Totafot. 2 of them are written without the vav, and the last one is written with an extra vav. And so therefore, since that's the case, we should say, hold on. There's a problem with this. What's the problem? The problem with this is that our pasuk actually has the vav in 2 of them, and only does not have the vav in 1 of them. So that doesn't really. No, not correct. I'm talking about totafot. Here, let's see if vayu totafot beinecha, vayu totafot beinechem, vayu totafot. So it's a little bit of so Tosfos says that is a little bit of a different gears in the text of the Torah, basically, but we'll leave that aside. But anyway, let's assume the Gemara's version, which is inconsistent with our actual Masoretic text. So the first 2 totafot by the tefillin are written in the singular, and then totafot is written in the plural with the vav. Harei kana arba, so we have 4, and so maybe there's a footnote about that in the art school about that, but we'll look at it afterwards. So ahani krav ahani mesoras chamesha bate. So therefore, if you're going to say the mesoras, it'll be 6, and if you're going to say the yeshem mikra, you would have 6 batim, and if you have yeshem mesorah, you would have 4. So you why don't we say you need 5? Maybe you need to make 5 compartments of the tefillin. So no, several like Rabbi Akiva. No, they still hold like Rabbi Akiva. The Amar, he says that's not what Totafos is teaching us. It's teaching us Pat bekatfi ishtaim and Pat bafriki ishtaim. That it's teaching us that there's Totafot is a combination of a Katfian word and a African word, and Tat in Katfian is 2, and Pat in African is 2. So the tefillin are recorded. It's an African word in the Torah. Why would the Torah include an African word? This goes back to our parsha this week, because where does all the language come from? Rashi says that it says the beginning of the generation of the Dor HaPilaga, or the Dor HaFlaga, generation of the dispersion, and it says that everybody was speaking 1 language. And Rashi there writes Lashon HaKodesh, that they were all speaking Hebrew. And then they were dispersed into multiple languages. Here, let me just cite this pasuk. So I'm not just saying anything from memory, but it says here in chapter 11, verse 1, Vayikol Safa Achas. Udvar Machadim. Rashi says Safa Achas is Lashon HaKodesh. They're all speaking Hebrew. And then God sent them out, and they all spoke their own languages. But Hebrew was the Ortex, the original language. So all the other languages are coming from Hebrew. So basically, Tat and Afriki are really Hebrew, even though Tat and what is it? Tat and Pat are really Hebrew. They're originally coming from Hebrew. Okay, we'll stop here. This is today's daf. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem.